Well, hello. Welcome back to the Revolutionary Communist Podcast. My name is Joel Bergman. I'm here with Marco LaGrotta again. We are here to discuss. We have a new prime minister. Mark Carney has been sworn in now. He was elected leader of the Liberal Party on Sunday, and we're here to discuss what this means. What this means for working class people, what this means for Canada. I guess maybe we can just start off with a question: who is Mark Carney? I mean, he's making a lot of waves. The Liberal Party's up in the polls. I see a lot of people posting, a lot of friends and other people posting about how great he is. He said he was we're gonna win the trade war against Donald Trump. He's criticizing Pierre Poilievre. Um, so maybe we can just start from who is he? Is he our savior? Maybe we can start with that. I don't know if you have a few things you want to start off with, Marco.
Yeah, I think the first word that comes to mind is elite. Like when you think of,
Yep.
what is an elite? I think Mark Carney's like the archetype of that kind of person. It's the kind of people that Luigi Mangione likes to kill. I think is another way
Yeah.
of putting it. Governor of the Bank of Canada, Governor of the Bank of England, chair of Brookfield Asset Management, multi-billion-dollar company,
$1 trillion.
trillion-dollar.
Manages over $1 trillion in assets, I believe.
Yeah, and the enthusiasm of a wet rag, a really boring guy in a suit. But he comes forward at a very particular moment with the trade war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, pivotal time, and people are scared, um, justifiably, I think, in many ways. There's already been some job losses, people being fired. We can talk about that later, but Carney is seen by many as a safe pair of hands to guide the country through troubled waters. In particular, in establishment circles, liberal circles, corporate circles, I think they see him
Hmm.
as that safe pair of hands because of his background, as you mentioned. He also used to work for Goldman Sachs.
Hmm.
He worked for Bloomberg. I actually did a little math. If you add up Brookfield Investments, Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs, the assets they manage is collectively tens of trillions of dollars.
Hmm. Hmm.
Basically, this guy has been at the center of world finance capital
Hmm.
for most of his life, or a good part, last few decades.
Hmm.
This is who Mark Carney is.
Hmm.
He is a big finance capital guy.
Hmm.
Um, he said. This is what he represents. He represents kind of a safe pair of hands for the capitalist system. Um, I guess, how does he measure up in terms of what he's actually saying? Like, what is he gonna do? What is he proposing? Do you want to maybe say a few words?
Hmm. Well, maybe just to step back to talk again about what his history is, because he's kind of presenting himself as Captain Canada. I'm going to stand up for Canadians. But I think, another thing I was reading is Brookfield has a history of
Oh yeah, right.
robbing Canadians. Like I saw a report, the NDP put it out actually. I can't remember who originally published the report, but apparently in 2021, Brookfield managed to avoid paying something like $6.5 billion in taxes to the Canadian federal government. So this is an inkling into who this guy is, right? He's a face of big business. He's led corporations which have screwed Canadians for years and years and years, and now he's supposedly meant to be our savior. So I think you have to start there. But also, yeah, in terms of what he's supporting, um, he's supporting. They never say it openly. We were discussing this earlier. The liberals are very coy.
Wait a minute, sorry, just
Yeah,
a second. Could we go back to the Brookfield thing? Because there
yeah,
was some interesting thing about Brookfield.
yeah,
Because he's putting himself forward as the guy who's going to lead Canada against the threats from America, right?
yeah.
But there was some interesting stuff that came out about Brookfield. One, first, I'll just mention it, and then I'll let you talk about the other
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
He, they under Carney's watch, they moved their headquarters to New York.
yeah, yeah,
That's a good patriotic
yeah,
move.
yeah, yeah.
Right now, a lot of people are criticizing that. A lot of companies are starting to do that. They move their headquarters, move operations to America to avoid the having to deal with the negative
Mm-hmm.
consequences of the trade war, right? Um, but also, you had mentioned to me something earlier about Brookfield that I thought was interesting about Twitter.
Oh yeah, yeah. This was also in the NDP's report. I never realized this, but they were one of the main backers of Musk's acquisition of Twitter. They wrote a check for, I think it was $250 million for this, American reactionary, which just shows that at the end of the day, it's dollars and cents. It's not about Canada versus the U.S. It's not about patriotism. It's about making a buck. And Brookfield's an example of that. And Carney was there throughout that whole time. He tried to make it seem as though, I wasn't involved in the decision to move the headquarters to New York. He was there. He was there. So that's a load of crap.
Yeah, and he was there, as you said, when they, I find it funny that liberals hate Musk now, when they've been basically along for the ride the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember, it's people like Carney and the liberal establishment who promoted electric vehicles in the first place, as if that was going to save us from the environmental crisis. And now one of the leaders of this right populist movement is the guy who made his billions off of hundreds of billions off of electric vehicles.
You could think of it this way: he robbed billions from the Canadian taxpayer while giving hundreds of millions to Musk. That's who this guy is.
So he could take over Twitter, clamp down on left-wing voices, that whole thing. This is who Mark Carney is. But sorry, I had interrupted you. You were going to say a few things about what he was planning on doing.
Yeah. I mean, the liberals are very coy. They never say anything openly. They like to talk left and then govern from the right. It's the classic liberal MO. Yeah. But the fact is, honestly, I think the stunning thing about Mark Carney is just how open he's been about what he's going to do. Because he has been talking about, essentially, austerity. Now, of course, he doesn't use that word. He's not talking about, cutting benefits, cutting social programs, cutting transfers. But
he's got to get elected.
Well, he's got to get elected. Yeah, the thing with the liberals is that they're never open about what they're going to do. They're never open about carrying out austerity. But what he said is that, I'm going to separate the budget between, I think, the operating expenses and, what he calls like capital investment, long-term investment. And he's going to balance the budget on operating expenses. But what does that mean? It's an accounting word. But what does that mean in practice? That's, transfers for healthcare. That's things like EI. That's things like the civil service. So when you're talking about, I'm going to balance operating expenses, what that means is I'm going to cut programs. He says, we're not going to touch healthcare, though. We're not going to touch EI. But then you take those out of the equation, what's left? And you had a deficit. What was the deficit last year? Something like
over $60 billion.
Yeah. So where is this money going to come from? Because there's not much left. So the fact is, he can't say it openly, but this would mean cutting healthcare. This would mean cutting EI and other programs.
Yeah. So he's definitely hinting at that. He talked about in his speech on Sunday, which I watched, where he won the Liberal leadership race by a pretty resounding margin. He won by over 86%, I think it was. He even beat Chrystia Freeland in her riding, in her home riding, which I think signals that people were really turning their backs on the Trudeau brand. But yeah, he won, and he gave a speech. At the beginning of the speech, right at the very beginning, right out of the gate, he starts worshiping Jean Chrétien, which I think... I'm old enough to remember Jean Chrétien, his government in the 1990s. If you weren't old enough to remember that, well, the Jean Chrétien government carried out the biggest cuts to healthcare and education in the history of Canada. They were obsessed with balancing the budget, and they did, and they balanced the budget on our backs. Actually, one of the reasons why the healthcare system's gotten so bad was precisely because of the Chrétien and then Martin government, because Martin took over from Chrétien after. And that he starts by saying this is what inspired him and his family to become liberals. That's what he said. And that and it was particularly the fiscal responsibility of Jean Chrétien. They use words like this. What that means in plain speak is making your life worse, actually. In this context, economic context, it is tough decisions, what they call it. Cuts to healthcare, education spending, cuts to EI. There's a number of things in the federal budget that, yeah, you mentioned this operating expenses thing, that he's going to balance budget and operating expenses means austerity measures. Pierre Poilievre hasn't even gone this far to say that. So this is what Carney is signaling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in terms of where he's going to spend the money, because he made an interesting comment. He's talked about, we'll run a small deficit on long-term investments. And you might be thinking, okay, things like roads, infrastructure. But he's also added military infrastructure, because that's also, if you build an army base or something like that, if you build an airfield for the army, that's also infrastructure. That's also. So it makes you wonder, okay, Trump is putting this incredible pressure to raise defense spending. And now Carney's saying, well, we'll run a deficit on things like military infrastructure. That's where the money's going to be going. The hospitals are falling apart, but we'll shower money. We'll build an army base.
Yeah, so on that, actually, that's an important issue here that we should talk about, because there's all this talk about beating Trump, fighting back against Trump. We won't give in to his demands, right? Go the liberals, and they're all saying it. We won't give in to his demands. In the same, almost sometimes the same sentence, they're pledging increased military spending.
Yeah.
So Carney has said, so Trudeau, in the response to the pressure from Trump to increase military spending, Trump's saying, look at Canada. They keep basically riding on our coattails. Yeah. They want to do, they're doing a purchase of military jets, but they're saying they're basically piggybacking on our purchase. Why don't you make your own jets? Why don't you purchase your own jets? Yeah. He said, we're getting 48 icebreakers. He just said it yesterday. 48 icebreakers made. And Canada said, can we use them? He said, get your own icebreakers. Anyway, it's all connected to military spending, because this is for military purposes, right?
Yeah.
In the North. And he said, basically Trudeau, Trump has said, you got to defend yourself. He said that to Europe. He's saying it to Canada. Don't ask us to defend. You got to increase your military spending to at least 2% of GDP. Actually, Trump says 5% sometimes.
Yeah.
You know how he is. But his pressure, art of the deal, sort of push for more than you might get. But he's... and Trudeau has said, okay, they'll get to 2% by 2032. What's Carney said? Carney said, is Carney now saying we're going to resist Trump's demands? No, he said, we'll do your demand by 2030. That's what he said. We'll do it 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
Bill Blair, who's the Minister of Defense, I believe, he said he thinks they can do it by 2027, which is in 2 years.
Yeah.
So this is what the liberals are pivoting to. They're actually giving in to one of Trump's key demands, and Carney is actually wanting to fast track that. And as you said, this is a lot of what the capital expenses stuff is going to be, military spending. He also, in a discussion about energy infrastructure, he said he would be prepared in English. This is important. He said he would be prepared to use the Emergency Measures Act to make sure development projects were basically rammed through, probably violating Indigenous rights, violating provinces that don't want it, i.e. Quebec, maybe BC, I don't know. Pipelines, basically, because this is a huge question with the oil if with the trade war, if they're not able to get oil to the American market, basically Alberta industry is dead. So they're panicking, and this is what he said. Then people asked him what he meant, and then he said a different answer in French. He said, I would never do that. So obviously but you can see the need of Canadian capitalism is to do this. So he's going to run a deficit to spend money on capital expenses, military, infrastructure projects. This project is just another way of saying corporate supports, corporate welfare or infrastructure for corporations. Like, Trudeau spent however many $1 billion on Trans Mountain. It's these types of things that he's talking about. So this is what Carney really wants to do. This is what he represents.
And think of the cost of that, because you mentioned sometimes
the cost is important.
Trump talks about going to not just 3%. I think that's the Business Council of Canada. They've said we should hit 3%.
Yeah, the bourgeois in Canada want 3.
Yeah, and I think they thought maybe that would appease Trump, but Trump came right back at them and said, now it's 5%.
He always wants more.
Yeah, so they don't learn. These people are very, stupid people. They don't learn. But what would 5% mean? Depending on what timeline you're looking at, you're talking about 60, 70, 80 billion dollars more a year on the army. You look at the transfers to the provinces, that almost makes up the entirety of the healthcare transfer. So
Yeah, it
where's this
does.
money going to come from? It's going to come from us. They could talk military funding in the abstract, but someone's got to pay for that at the end of the day. And it's you and I that are going to pay for it at the end of the day. They conveniently leave out that part.
Yeah, exactly. So the increased military spending. So this is why Carney. Let's just put it straight. Carney is lying. Carney, like a liberal, a good liberal, they always lie. He says he's going to be fiscally responsible. He's going to be a good manager. And then at the same time, he says he's not going to touch healthcare. He's not going to touch education funding. He's not going to make cuts. And he's criticizing Polyev for making those cuts or wanting to make cuts. But this is a lie. There is no way that he can rectify the situation. You're talking about tens of billions of dollars, upwards of $100 billion that he's going to have to get for military funding. He's going to already, if he wants to balance the budget, it's going to, and then also, how much money is he going to spend on capital expenses, infrastructure? So money doesn't grow on trees. He's going to have to get it from somewhere. Connected to the balancing the budget thing, which he says he wants to do, I think is also a few other things that maybe we should get into. So a lot of effort is being put into now in the media, from the liberal establishment, whatnot, to show how different he is from Pierre Polyev. He's the new savior, right? But when we look at it, as we've already explained, on balancing the budget, actually, he's gone further. He said he's going to balance operating expenses in 3 years.
Yeah.
Polyev never said that. He actually refused to commit to it because he said that he was going to be left with a dumpster fire. And he can't commit to that. So on the balancing the budget, technically, Mark Carney is promising more cuts than Polyev. On the military spending, Polyev said also that he couldn't commit to it because he was left with a mess. Whereas Mark Carney's saying he's going to do it by 2030. So Mark Carney is actually more hawkish, proposing more military spending than Pierre Polyev.
Well, this is the funny thing, because a lot of people hate the liberals. But the common thing you hear every election cycle is, but they're the lesser evil, and so we need to vote for the lesser evil. But if you look at just what the two parties have said over the last period, of course, they're all evil. That's what we say.
Yeah.
But
all capitalists.
They're all crooks at the end of the day. But in many ways, based on what they've said, you can make the argument that the liberals are the greater evil at the moment, because the liberals openly talk about, we're going to slash the budget, cut operating expenses. The conservatives have been more coy about that. He doesn't even say balance the budget. Now they say, I'm going to fix the budget.
Right.
Is the
Fix
kind
it
of,
for who?
is the kind of language he uses, and other things. Referencing Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. And I think that's another thing in terms of the lesser evil. The worst austerity in modern Canadian history federally was carried out by the Liberal Party. This is a fact. But of course, at the end of the day, they're both going to inherit the same crisis, and they're both going to be forced to carry out cuts. I think that's the main point.
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately, we're going to be really met with this wave of this lesser evilist argument. You have it every single Canadian election, the big bad conservatives. I see it also more with the Polyev phenomenon, because people say he's a Canadian Trump and we need to block him and he's evil or something like that. But just on the basis of who they are, actually one of Carney's main criticisms of Polyev, if you listen to what he says, is that Polyev isn't a capitalist. Is that he's a politician. I'm a capitalist. I've worked for big finance capital. I know how the economy works. He's appealing to the ruling class. He is not on our side. He's not our friend. Polyev is a bastard, of course, but we can't fall into this lesser evil argument.
No,
really.
And the criticisms are weird. Like, first of all, saying he's like a Canadian Trump. I think Trump went out of his way to say, listen, he's not a MAGA guy. He's not a MAGA guy. There are important differences. Trump is a very unique figure. But also the criticism of the liberals, of the conservatives, has been absurd. Like, okay, the slogan before for the conservatives was Canada is broken, which in many ways, strip out their policies. We say that because Canada is broken.
True. It's broken, yeah.
But now the liberals have attacked him and said, well, how could you say that Canada is the greatest country on earth and also that Canada is broken? They attacked him on that.
Right. Yeah.
And so he's now kind of changed his position. Now it's Canada first. You know, he makes sure to have the biggest Canadian flag whenever he goes to speak somewhere. But the fact is, Canada is broken. Absolutely, it's broken.
Yeah, but according to Chrystia Freeland, it's not a recession; it's a vibe
Yeah,
session.
it's a vibe
She's
session.
borrowing from was it from Biden?
Yeah.
Basically, they're saying, "Well, the economy's doing really good. I don't know why everyone's angry.
Yeah,
it's just your mood. It's your problem. You feel
Yeah.
bad."
and then she's surprised she gets 8% in the leadership election.
Well, yeah, exactly. So this is really what you have. You have this obnoxious, elitist, liberal
Yeah,
approach. That we can't fall into that lesser evilism. The Carney is not the lesser evil. Quite clearly on certain things, he is the establishment capitalists. He's their candidate. This is their darling, really.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
and I think just on that point as well, he's also our first unelected prime minister.
oh shit, yeah, we
So,
didn't mention
yeah.
this. We should get into that.
Not an unimportant point. Yeah.
This is the first time in the history of the country that this has ever happened. We have a prime minister who is not in the House of Commons. He has never been elected. He was elected actually by a very small number of people. I don't know if it was the lowest turnout, but it was a drastic fall in turnout.
Yeah, it was one of the worst turnouts in a leadership election race in modern Canadian history. I think it was something like 150, maybe at most 200,000
A
people.
couple 100,000 people elect this guy.
Yeah.
He's not in a riding. He wasn't elected by the Canadian population or anywhere. And now he's the prime minister. It's the first time we've had an unelected banker
Yeah.
who's basically a finance capital guy as the prime minister of the country. This is nothing to celebrate.
Mhm.
And also, how did we get here? We shouldn't forget. We've mentioned it previously. We got here because the Justin Trudeau was in dire straits. They were being pummeled in the polls. People were angry at them. So they appealed to the representative of the British crown, the king,
Yeah.
to cancel the parliament so that the other parties couldn't bring the government down,
Yeah.
even though they were Trudeau's approval ratings were lower than Joe Biden's were before he was defeated. Hated government uses a frankly a feudal maneuver, anti-democratic maneuver to shut down the parliament so that they can shift the deck chairs on their sinking ship to get this unelected banker
Yeah.
and now we have him as the prime minister of the country.
Mm-hmm.
That's fundamentally what's taken place.
No,
you won't read that in the Globe and Mail or any of the big capitalist papers, but that is what has taken place.
Yeah. No, the bourgeoisie used the monarchy to shut down the parliament and have now installed a banker who was elected by nobody to rule the country. It's really stunning when you take a step back and they talk about Canada's the greatest country in the world and we're a democratic country like no other. What on earth is democratic about that? This is the kind of stuff you hear about in dictatorships.
Yeah, so this is really quite something because quite often you hear liberals always refer to the anti-democratic dictatorial nature of people like Donald Trump and the far right people. But when you look at it, the liberals around the world, and I do think what's happened in Canada is that very anti-democratic maneuver they just did to put this unelected banker in power. You've had this all over the world where you've had, I remember even early last year, The Economist, which really represents the far-sighted kind of bourgeoisie in Britain. They put out this paper that talked about how democracy was under threat. And what they said, if you read it, is there's all these elections this year in 2024.
Yeah.
And the people that we don't like
Yeah.
are leading the polls and will get elected.
Yeah.
How's that a threat to democracy? Basically, they're saying, if our people don't get elected, democracy's in trouble. They canceled the elections in Romania.
Yeah.
That was one of the ones. So I think this is connected to this, and I mention this precisely because a lot of people in Canada, a lot of people even on the left, buy into this argument that the right wing are anti-democratic dictators. Yes, of course, they're bastards. But let's not let that lean into this idea that somehow the liberals are these big defenders of democracy. No, if anything, they've been the bastion of supporting dictatorship and clamping down on democracy around the world for decades. This has been the main establishment, And the Liberals in Canada have been an integral part of that in the world, this imperialist Western establishment, And now they just played this anti-democratic game. Yeah, I would like to maybe move on to one question. There's a couple more things I think we have to deal with here on the question of Carney.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about his economic plan, or his plan of basically says he's going to run deficits for a number of years, but only to do capital expenses. Basically, what this means in plain talk is he's going to cut social services, or he's prepared to go into deficit only to do big projects that benefit capitalism. That's what it means. But I thought it'd be important to address. So how does that? We're faced with the Canadian capitalism is really faced with an existential crisis, and this is where a lot of people think, okay, Carney. Oh, we need Carney because he was the governor of the Bank of Canada that got us through the storm in 2008, 2009. Oh, he helped manage the Brexit negotiations in Britain when he was the governor of the Bank of England, right? So obviously he's the safe pair. Who's pair of hands? Poilievre, he's a nobody. He's a career politician. I think, and this is clearly the argument the Liberals are saying. So I think we need to tackle the question of will his plan work? Forget whether or not he's a banker. He is. He's the capitalist man. But a lot of people are scared. There's hundreds of thousands of jobs on the line, and people maybe want to vote for him because they think that he's gonna see the ship through the storm. But yeah, I think we need to address this question of will his plan actually work? I don't know if you want to start, but yeah.
I've heard this argument too, that Carney is the best pair of hands to take on Trump. He's got experience. He helped manage the fallout from 2008, Brexit, and so on. But the fact is, I've thought about that. I don't understand that line of argument. I really don't know what Carney's going to do to take on Trump. Maybe he'll bore him to death. I mean, I think that's maybe the main advantage he has over.
He'll come with banker's notes about numbers and shit.
Exactly. Yeah. But the fact is, we have to take a step back. The situation is still the same as it was. You've just got a new guy leading the country. The fact is, you still have a small Canadian economy, which was already in a state of freefall before Trump was reelected. You've got, Trump in the White House leading the most powerful economy on earth, who said, and he's been explicitly clear. A lot of people say, oh, we can't make heads or tails of what Trump wants. I think he's been perfectly clear. We don't need manufacturing in Canada. We don't need lumber produced in Canada. We can do it in the United States. We don't need jobs. We don't need auto plants in Windsor. We'll bring them to Detroit. I think he's been perfectly clear. Now,
the fentanyl thing is a distraction. He's only using that to claim it's a national emergency and get around the UMSA agreement, the trade agreement. So it's not about that. It's about the economics, clearly.
And the fact is, there's nothing they can do. I mean, I think what's happened in Ontario the last few days is quite interesting because you have Ford, who, by the way, Ford had one of Carney's first meetings was with Ford.
Yeah.
And I think they went to a diner together. They talked about how much they enjoyed each other's company.
Had a nice date.
How much they admire each other. I think they're quite simpatico on their approach at the moment, which is interesting. You've got a conservative supporting the liberal, but that also tells you something. But also, this 25% tax on energy exports.
That Ford did.
From Ontario. And then, of course, Ford put forward the tax. Maybe a few hours later, Trump came out, said, I don't like that. The steel and aluminum tariffs, which were 25%, guess what? Now they're 50% because of what Ford's done. And it was maybe a few hours after that, and Ford capitulated. Immediately. We withdrew the tax, and then the following day he met with Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. So this is going to be the same thing.
It shows that the Canadian economy, anything that Canada can do against America, it's a behemoth. The American market, American capitalism, the most powerful country that has ever existed. Anything that Canada can do, it's like a fly. It will have an effect maybe, but not very much.
Mm-hmm.
And America could just ruin the Canadian economy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that really shows that relationship that Trump can just force capitulation all down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we'll see how that plays out with Carney. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's the example of Ford.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the fact is, what has happened with Ford will be repeated at a national level with Carney. Because, at the end of the day, these tariffs and so on, Canada does not have the economic muscle to take on the United States. That is a simple fact rooted in economics.
Yep.
It doesn't matter who's helming the ship. You cannot change that basic fact.
Yep. Under capitalism, that is the rules. That are the laws that exist. And so all the politicians are clamoring about trying to resist Trump, but Trump's argument, I mean, is a bit irresistible. America is the dominant imperialist power, and there's a crisis, and they're looking to offload the cost of that onto their neighbors, to other countries around the world.
And he's also winning the trade war, I
yeah.
would say. Yeah, I read a really deranged opinion piece in the Globe and Mail the other day. I can't remember who wrote it. But essentially, he was talking about David and Goliath and how David is now beating Goliath, referring to Canada. He said Canada's winning the trade war. In what world is Canada winning the trade war? And you saw the stats, something like half of Canadian businesses said they're already looking at shifting production to the United States.
Yeah, there's already been a list of layoffs. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a bunch here. I mean, I won't read them all, but Algoma Steel, Sault Ste. Marie, they've laid off a number of people. Another steel plant, 140 layoffs. The mayor of Drummondville saying he's worried about 3,000 jobs disappearing. This is just a few days of the trade war. And that's what's happening. That's the reality.
So as we detailed a couple of weeks ago when we discussed this is what is coming. The trade war will mean layoffs. Trump is trying to deindustrialize Canada and export unemployment to Canada and bring jobs back to America. He's been explicit. He's been super clear about that. And we're starting to see these layoffs. Mm-hmm. And this actually leads to another thing that's related to Carney. Carney has been, if you listen to his speech on Sunday, you listen to a lot of what he'd done, and this is really what the Liberals do best, is they are the party of Canadian nationalism. They have been historically. They really have been. And they have really tapped into this. He's using a lot of hockey analogies. And when someone else drops the gloves, we're always ready. And like in hockey, or like in trade, like in hockey, we'll win, and saying all this stuff. And he's really trying to say we're all in the ship together as Canadians. We all stand up and we unite to protect Canada and blah, 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 blah. This actually shows the danger of that argument. Because actually, in any nation, there are different classes and there are different class interests. And so therefore, we are not actually on the same team. We're not all in it together. And you're seeing it now. These companies that all claim that we're all Canadian and we're all on the same team, that support Carney or support Poilievre, maybe, some of them, they all support the capitalist parties because they're going to do what they want it to do. What are they doing? They're firing their workers. Yeah. They're saying they're going to protect their profits. They're laying people off. Yeah. So we're starting to see that. That is happening everywhere. And so I think it is our duty as communists, as we discussed on the podcast before. If you want, listen to the podcast we did on the trade war. We need to defend a class approach, an internationalist class approach. And I think the labor movement, as we discussed in the last time, really needs a different approach from what it's taken now, which has been cozying up to the government, supporting counter tariffs, leaning into the trade war, supporting one side of the trade war, which doesn't lead to anything good. Actually, the last time there was a really significant trade war, the biggest trade war was in the 30s. Yeah. And what was that? Both sides implemented tariffs. And if anyone thinks that the tariff's going to save jobs, like Sean Fain from the UAW supports Trump's tariffs, even though he didn't support Trump in the election, he supports the tariffs to protect jobs. Well, look what happened in the 1930s. The protectionist trade war in the 1930s led to 30% unemployment in Canada, over 20% unemployment in America. This is not benefiting working class people at all. So the bourgeoisie in the crisis won't be the ones to deal with the crisis. They'll offload the cost of that to working class people. Yeah. And really that's what that means. So this shows that danger of that Canadian nationalist argument. We need a class approach. And I think the labor movement, in terms of all these job losses that you've mentioned there, needs a mass campaign. No job losses. strikes, pickets, factory occupations.
Yeah.
Don't let anything being taken out of the economy. If they're going to shut down a factory, don't let it be taken out of the economy. Don't let them take the jobs and bring it to America. These so-called Canadian patriots that care more about their profits than workers' livelihoods, we shouldn't let
Yeah.
them do that. I haven't seen anything like that from the labor movement so far, even though I think that in the working class, there is an appetite for that
Mm-hmm.
because that logically flows from the situation. But yeah, you had some
I
information
just
about that,
wanted,
maybe.
yeah, I wanted to read you something. This was in the newspaper yesterday because the fact is, nationalism is having its moment right now.
Yeah.
And it's, you see it, there is support for retaliatory tariffs. There is support for Buy Canada. I'm sure we all have friends who have, canceled trips to the United States and stuff
Yeah.
like that. But I think the point you made is an important one, that there is a class anger that's still there beneath the surface. And as the situation evolves, that's going to become magnified more and more. And just to maybe illustrate that point, because there's an interview they did with this steel worker. I think it was in Hamilton. The company's called National Steel Car. They manufacture the freight containers. And anyway, it's this a pipe fitter at this plant. And this was the quote he gave. He says, "We're deeply concerned about our future." He's talking about the trade war. But he says, "Manufacturing has been under attack for decades now. So this is just another attack on the working class. We're trying to simply put food on our tables. It just feels like the ruling class continuously punches down on us." And that's just a pipe fitter in Hamilton.
We adhere to that position 110%.
Because it didn't start with Trump. And
Did
the
not.
point this worker is making is entirely correct.
That's his experience.
Yeah.
So I think that is the experience of a lot of workers, especially in industries like the steel industry, auto manufacturing, that have hundreds of thousands of jobs lost from free trade, and now we'll have jobs lost from protectionism.
Mm-hmm.
So just because free trade failed doesn't mean we support protectionism, because these are both capitalist policies implemented by the bourgeoisie to protect their profits, and we shouldn't let them suggest that somehow these policies are protect our jobs, because at the end of the day, they care more about their profits than anything else. And if their profits are threatened, they'll lay off the workers, as we're seeing happen. This is just the first trickle of layoffs, but this trickle could quite quickly turn into a flood. But I guess coming back a bit, maybe we can end on that. We were talking a bit about whether Mark Carney will be able to be that safe pair of hands and weather the storm. His plan, as we've said, in terms of the budget, is untenable. There's going to have to be cuts in social services. There's going to have to be layoffs in the public sector in one way, shape, or form. You can't increase spending. You can't. Actually, another thing we didn't actually get into, I wanted to mention that. He's going to cut the carbon tax. Isn't that Pierre Poilievre's main demand? Axe the tax. And he said, sure.
Yeah.
Showing that actually this carbon tax that didn't really do, it was a drop in the bucket, didn't really do anything to solve the environmental crisis. Tossed aside like it didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And then also axing the capital gains increase.
Yeah.
Which is what Poilievre demanded.
Yeah.
So they are perfectly aligned on that. But those two things are also going to cost the government tens of billions of dollars in revenue. So there is a contradiction right at the root here. His plan will not work. He will have to cut. That is what is coming. But on the industrial front, his plan, I think, will also not work. Because the government, the Trudeau government, and even, to be honest, even Harper before, they had rolled out the carpet for corporate interest. They had provided massive bailouts for corporate Canada in the form of tens of billions of dollars a year. Provinces have also done this because Canadian capitalism has been on life support. Remember, we all remember the Trans Mountain bailout. I don't even remember how much money that was. Tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
There's been big bailouts to Bombardier. They basically supported this building of this Northvolt. Which is now in jeopardy because that company is not doing so good.
Yeah, I think they're bankrupt.
Yeah, they're bankrupt in Europe. So, but the Canadian government and the Ontario government have put forward billions of dollars. I think it was $4 million per job to try to open that factory. Anyway, there's been a number of these types of things that happen around the country. And if this is what Carney's suggesting, Well, history would dictate that that doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
That has been the method that has been attempted by the government, and it hasn't worked to. But basically, what he said is that's going to create this
Mm-hmm.
private investment stream.
Yeah. And I think
Actually,
I think we should be clear on that point, because what he's talking about is not public housing, public
yeah,
infrastructure, because these things would be very good.
yeah,
But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about public investment.
yeah,
He says to leverage private infrastructure.
exactly.
But this is another way of saying taxpayer money to help pad the profits of the rich and powerful. That's what he's suggesting.
Yeah.
And you've seen it. Like, I don't know if you mentioned, but like you saw this with Stellantis as
Oh
well,
yeah,
which was one of those auto manufacturers which got,
it was electric batteries. Yeah,
either
yeah,
batteries or vehicles, I can't remember,
yeah,
but billions of dollars from the federal and provincial governments, and they've just stalled production
yeah.
at their Brampton facility. So they're going to be milking the taxpayer
So
for everything they're worth.
the subsidies don't work to protect jobs. They don't work to get investment going.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you could say, oh, you can maybe point to an example where it worked, but it's at best temporary.
Mm-hmm.
At best, it's ephemeral. It's not going to increase the productivity of labor. It's not going to increase competitiveness of Canadian industry. The only thing that will do that is cuts to the corporate tax rate, attacking unions, whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
which neither Carney or Polyev have the backbone to say
Mm-hmm.
because they wouldn't be able to get elected on it.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, at some point down the road, that will be inevitable
Yeah.
for Canadian capitalism to compete.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and Carney and Polyev hint a bit at it. They hint we need to be more competitive. We need to
Mm-hmm.
unleash. I think Polyev says free enterprise,
Mm-hmm.
the free market. Carney says similar things,
Mm-hmm.
but they're all hinting in this direction. And if you read the pages of the Financial Times or you read any statement from the Chamber of Commerce,
Mm-hmm.
they're all pushing, all the big banks, they're all pushing in this direction. So this is what is to come.
Yeah.
Whoever wins the election, it's not clear. I don't think it's clear that Mark Carney will win. I think he has a good chance.
Mm-hmm.
And if the polls are any indication, and there's one thing actually we didn't address, is the Liberals have been resurrected.
Mm-hmm.
They were in the doldrums.
Yeah.
Polyev was looking like he was going to win historic majority.
Mm-hmm.
But they have gone up. There's been a handful of polls that put him neck and neck with Carney as leader. But actually, interesting enough, that seems to be mostly at the expense of the NDP.
Yeah.
Which
and
we
the bloc as well.
And the bloc, yeah, which we haven't touched on so much, the question of the NDP. But
Yeah.
unsurprisingly, from a Marxist point of view, the NDP's approach of cheerleading Canadian nationalism and counter tariffs and buy Canadian has not worked.
Yeah. And can I just say, like you said, it's hard to predict whether it's going to be the Liberals, the Conservatives who win the election.
Yeah.
I think the one thing we can say with almost certainty, though,
Yeah.
is that the NDP is not going to do well. I think that's the one thing.
They don't
Why on
stand
earth-
for anything, really.
Why on earth would you vote for these people? If you want to vote for the Liberal Party, you vote for the real Liberal
Yeah.
Party, as opposed to the Orange Party, which is saying almost fundamentally
Yeah.
the same thing that's being said by the Liberal Party. But also, just another point, because they have seen a resurgence, I think a point that needs to be made is it's not enthusiasm necessarily for Carney. I don't see people out on the street saying, yeah, Carney, he's a real great guy, he's a fighter. I don't think anybody
It's fear.
feels that way. It's fear. You know, they've painted the Conservatives as pro-American,
Yep.
which has worked amongst a layer of the population. But the main thing is fear of Trump. And they see, like you said, the Liberals as the party of, you know, the Canadian flag.
Yep.
You know, that's why he's talking about hockey so much.
Yep.
Right? It's the same with Ford. Like, people gave Ford another majority.
Yep.
But I don't think that's because people have forgotten what he's done to working people in the last few years. Like, I remember talking to my grandmother about it. She wanted to vote for Ford.
Okay.
But what she said is, listen, he's an absolute crook, but we need him against Trump.
Yeah.
And I think that's the attitude of a lot of people. I think
Yeah.
the same with Carney. These people are crooks, but right now Trump is the main enemy.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the same as enthusiasm for the Liberal Party
Yeah.
or the Conservatives.
Yeah, so I think that explains the situation. On the question of the NDP, just to show what they're saying and why they've kind of been unable to really create any sort of enthusiasm or support behind them.
We
You
saw
know,
the comment.
I got the comment. He
Yeah.
said Jagmeet Singh today, because
Yeah.
Prime Minister Trudeau is gone. Hated, as I mentioned, hated. Look at
Yeah.
any polls. Actually, you don't even need to look at a poll. Ask anybody what their opinion of Justin Trudeau is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a negative opinion. It's very bad. Now, if I was a politician, a bourgeois politician running for office, I would think that that would be a pretty good thing to do to criticize Trudeau because a lot of people don't like him.
Mm-hmm.
No, apparently Jagmeet Singh hasn't clued in on that yet. This is what he said. I want to congratulate Prime Minister Trudeau on his time in office and wish him well. He served our country through tumultuous times. Whatever disagreements we may have had, his love for Canada is always evident. What does he say? He says, I know, he says a bunch of stuff about his family and stuff, but he's basically congratulating the guy who was forced to resign because everyone hated him, who represented the interests of Canadian capitalism, who outflanked the NDP, and basically tied the NDP to the Liberal Party, and has led to the NDP declining in support, precisely because the leadership of the party has adopted this approach that they're friends with the Liberals.
Now, what does that say to working people? Like, this guy has, how many strikes did he crush just over the last 2 years? And Singh's coming out and saying, hey, buddy, good job.
Good job.
All around, good job. It's like, how you feel? You're a trade union member. And you're listening to this guy. Hey, buddy, good job. This is ridiculous.
No, you should come out saying the legacy of Trudeau is absolutely horrible. Mm-hmm. Working class people have lost. Living standards have decreased. He legislated strikes back to work. He's been an absolute disaster. The NDP will be completely different. If they were a socialist party, they stood for that, that's what they would say. But they're not saying it. And that you see this constantly happen. Anyway, I think we're more or less at an end. Just to wrap things up. So it's like we said, it's difficult to predict who's going to win the election. Could be Carney, could be Poilievre. Definitely, I think the bourgeois establishment would prefer Carney. He is their man. He is that sort of safe pair of hands.
Well, he's them.
He is them, more or less. He's literally them. He probably goes to the same country club or whatever. They go to the same places to eat, or whatever. They have the same servants, maybe. I don't know. He's actually not divulging how much he's worth, so Poilievre's criticizing him for that. It's probably a lot of money. He's a billionaire, probably. Anyway, it's difficult to predict who's going to win. But I think both ways forward, Poilievre or Carney, as we've detailed in this podcast, they agree on all the basic fundamentals. And as you said, the situation, because we have Carney, has not changed the situation one iota. It hasn't changed. The Canada, actually, if you think about it, has had an extremely privileged position. Canadian capitalism has had a very privileged position on the world market. First, basically being a beneficiary of the British Empire. And now having this so-called special relationship with American imperialism, being actually quite a key player, being the little buddy, the good cop, you could say, of American imperialism, and having the added benefit of being the trade partner. That is done. And everything we have known in Canada, the entire political setup, I think the welfare state, this middle class, that was based on that. Canadian capitalism can no longer afford that. So whichever person we have, I think they're going to have a very tough time fighting Trump. I think the economic repercussions are going to be massive. And I think that the burden will be offloaded onto the backs of Canadian workers. And the result will be a very tumultuous class struggle with revolutionary implications. And this is why we give no faith in Carney. We should have no faith in Carney, no faith in Poilievre, no faith in any bourgeois politician. But the road is open to the building of a genuine Marxist organization, the Revolutionary Communist Party. We believe that through this process, working class people will find their way back to communism, as they actually once did in Canada. Many people back in the 20s and 30s were communists. That was the heyday of the communist movement. People will find their way back to that. So if you are one of those people, if you're listening to this and you're worried and you're scared and you can see the problems and you are upset at the NDP, you don't like Carney, you don't like the Liberals, you're smart enough to see that, and you don't like Poilievre for the obvious reasons, and you want a communist alternative, you want to fight for socialism, you need to get involved. You need to join the Revolutionary Communist Party. And I think that's a takeaway from this. history doesn't just happen. We need to intervene in it. Can't we? We have to intervene in this process, and I do believe that in front of us is a very a period in which working class people are going to be waking up, rising up, and fighting for their living conditions. As you said about this, quoting this steel worker, he clearly identifies what the actual problem is.
Mm-hmm.
We just need to build a revolutionary leadership. So yeah, that is what we're doing with the Revolutionary Communist Party, and I hope you get involved.